Today is Carl Linnaeus's birthday. So it's a very fitting day to host today's lunchtime lecture, which goes back to Linnaeus, back to our origin. And it's my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Annika Ponten, who has undertaken research, I think quite a lot of it in the Linnean Society Library, using our manuscripts and books from the Linnean collections. And her thesis studied the household of of Carl Linnaeus, and it's a micro study of the household and its material status combined with a study of some of Linnaeus's texts. And I know, Annika, you're going to show, but if you're ever curious, and we do have a copy of Annika's thesis in the library, here it is. I am not going to attempt to pronounce the Swedish title. I will leave that to Annika. And lastly, I want to say, Annika also does 18th century dancing. And I last saw Annika in the flesh rather than on Zoom. I think it was last year at a conference in Uppsala. It was in the orangery of the botanical garden in Uppsala. So the picture that Annika has her background, has the Uppsala Botanical Garden with Linnaeus's house. It was at the back. And Annika and a few musicians led us into a few dances, which was an amazing way of closing a conference. And it was very special. So Annika, over to you. I'm very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so very much.
Oh, sorry, that's my fault. I muted Annika instead of myself. Apologies, Padma.
No problem.
Am I back again?
Yes, you are. Sorry.
So thank you so much for this introduction, Isabel. I'm really honored and happy to have been invited to give this talk on this special day, as it is Linnaeus' birthday, as you've heard. It is true, I did a lot of this research in the library of the Linnean Society, and I started some time ago, actually. So when I started, a lot of it was not digitized yet the way it is today. Here is my picture of the book that you just saw Isabel holding up. It is 3 years ago since I defended this, it is in Swedish. It is also available online. There is just a summary in English. The title, which in Swedish then is Kär hustru vackra barn bodde I ett palais, that's almost a quotation from a text by Linnaeus, and it translates to dear or beloved wife, beautiful children lived in a palace. And this text where Linnaeus writes this is one where he describes his own life. It's in a way a CV or so. Some people would call this text an autobiography, but I think it's the function of it is more what we would call a CV than an autobiography, actually. So my study for the thesis had three main parts. One was on the professor's household, identity and materiality in practice. And there was one part on self-presentation in the Linnaeus household. And that part had to do, I analyzed the texts and also the contemporary portraits of Linnaeus in that part. The last section is on medicine, moral and fashion, the scientist's forming of a persona. And this last part is maybe the most sort of traditional when it comes to history of ideas and science, which is my background. In that part, I use texts mainly and analyze texts. It's the lecture notes for dietetics and also some of the dissertations and some letters that I mainly use there. With this study as a starting point, I am going to talk about the Linnaeus household and how they formed identity and the materiality of the household, and also how they used these material aspects to form their identity. But I thought it's maybe good to start with a definition, or the definition I used of what a household is. If you go to OED, it says the inhabitants of a house considered collectively, a group of people, especially a family, living together as a unit, a domestic establishment, including any servants, attendants, etc. And in the 18th century, of course, a household was most often formed around a married couple. And for that reason, I have mainly studied the period in Carl Linnaeus' life from the time he got married and until the death of his son, Carl Linnaeus Filius. And also in early modern times and in the 18th century, the household is also an important economic unit in the society. So a lot of historians have studied the household in various respects, both in Sweden and in an Anglo-Saxon context. So it's quite an important social unit, economic unit during this period, of course. So this particular household was formed or started, so to say, when Carl and Sara Elisabeth Moreae got married in 1739. They had met some years earlier. She is the daughter of the town physician in the town Falun in Sweden, and in Falun there was a huge mine, copper mine, but they also got other metals out of this mine, but mainly at this time a copper mine. And her father owned shares in this mine also, so he was a rather wealthy town physician there. And they met when Carl first traveled to Dalarna or Dalecarlia. Then it took some time before they got married, because before they could marry, he needed to be able to support a family, support her and support a family economically. And at the time when they met, he didn't have any position, he didn't have a job, he didn't have any proper graduation from university either. So her father sort of demanded that he could show that he could support her before they could get married. So we have this whole period when Linnaeus goes to Holland in between. So between they got engaged and got married, he was abroad and went to Holland for some years. Then he got back to Sweden and they married in 1739. They actually did not live together for some years in the beginning. So he settled down in Stockholm and worked as a physician there for a start. And she remained in the house of her parents the first years. So, for example, when the oldest son was born, they did not live together. She was still in Falun and he was in Stockholm. And then in 1741, Linnaeus was appointed professor at Uppsala University. And eventually they moved in. Here are all the children first. They got one son and 4 daughters that survived and grew up. They also had 2 other children that died as infants. So they had one son that he lived for about 3 years and a daughter that lived for a couple of weeks only. But 5 children that grew up and became adults. And the firstborn is the son, Carl Filius, or Carl Jr. He is later to succeed his father as professor also. Whereas the daughters, it varied. Some of them got married and some of them did not. So 2 got married and had children and 2 did not. So this is the family, and they lived in mainly in what was then the botanical garden of Uppsala University. And this is the same picture as I've got as a background. This garden was founded in the 17th century by another professor, also a professor of medicine, called Olof Rudbeck. And actually, the garden was one reason that Linnaeus came to Uppsala as a student, because this was one of the biggest botanical gardens in Northern Europe, at least. When he was appointed professor in 1741, he spent about 2 years redesigning the garden and also convincing the university that they needed to refurbish and rebuild the house, because the house was in rather bad condition when he was appointed professor. And the house is the one you can see to the right. That's the one they moved into in 1743. So in 1743, we can really say that they formed their own household in this building. And as you can see to the left in this picture, there are other buildings. They don't exist today. The house is the Linnaeus Museum today in Uppsala. The two economy buildings on the left, there are some archaeological remains of these, and they have actually recently been re-examined because they are building a new visitors center here for the moment. And before they started to build, they had some archaeological excavations performed there. And they have some interesting results. For example, in one of these buildings, we can now be pretty sure that some people were living, maybe the servants or maybe students or so lived in one of those buildings. And that's based on some archaeological findings that they have from there. The orangery you can see, that's the building in the very far back of the garden. When Linnaeus redesigned this garden, and he wanted it to reflect his classification system, he had the court architect Carl Linnaeus to actually plan the garden for him. And probably Linnaeus also worked on the building, so it's fair to say that it has many similarities to Linnaeus buildings. We have no actually really evidence that Linnaeus worked on the building, but we know he did the garden. The picture is from a dissertation from 1745. So 2 years after they moved in, Linnaeus wrote a dissertation for a master student, and this was the normal system. The professor would write the dissertation that the student would defend. He has written around 185 dissertations totally, Linnaeus. And this one is on the use of the garden, and also he describes the house a bit in this, both in the text and in the pictures in this dissertation. But they also had other houses. Here is a photo of what the house looks like today as the Linnaeus Museum. They also had some other houses. For example, in 1758, they bought an estate in the countryside, a couple of kilometers south of Uppsala. This is called Hammarby. It was a rather big farm, and they also bought some other farms in the same parish as Hammarby. So for a while, the Linnaeus family was actually the family that owned, they were the largest landowners in that parish for a while. Hammarby is also a museum today. I think there are a couple of details on this dissertation picture, on this one, that are very interesting, because it does tell us something about who actually lived here and what sort of function that these different parts of the garden and the houses had. If you look outside the building they lived in on the right and compare to what's in front of the economy buildings to the left, you will see these two details there. So on the right, outside the house they live in, we have a company in fine clothing, and to the left, in front of the economy buildings, we have this girl carrying water buckets. So it's no coincidence that of course, this group with fine clothing is outside the building they lived in, whereas the maid is outside the economy buildings. So it's all sort of designed to show what is behind them, what is inside there in the garden. And this group on the right, they may well represent the Linnaeus family and what they looked like and sort of who they aspired to be and which kind of social status they had. And I have, and I know you can't read what's on the right here, but I have looked in the university archives because there are lists of who the university paid taxes for. And the case was that the university paid taxes for all the footmen and maids employed by the professors and also other people employed by the university. So there is a large number of university households, and the university pays taxes for all the members of these households, and that includes footmen and maids. So through these sources, I've been able to establish how many footmen and maids were employed in the Linnaeus household. And this is, I mean, the archives are not digitized or so they are not so easily accessible. So this is the first time these figures were published. That was in my thesis. So between 1742 and 80, there were 25 footmen at least, and at least 81 maids. And I say at least because they registered this once a year, and it might be that it changed more often so that they had people coming and going in between those times when they made the list. So this is the lowest figure we can count on, I think. And they had at least one maid per year and a maximum 4. And most years they had one footman, or dräng in Swedish. Maid is called piga in Swedish. We also do get the names of all these people, and that's what you see on the right, the names of them. It's very easy to get any other information about them from any sources, actually, because many of those names are very common, and it's very hard to know which, let's say, Katarina Persdotter it is, because there will be very many in any source you will check, actually. But these, all these people were, of course, very important when it came to the work that was done in this house. Because the case is that in the 18th century at Uppsala University, the departments did not have any offices or any sort of special buildings. There was a university main building where they had lectures. So all the professors had lectures in the same building. And they also started to build some facilities like a chemical laboratory and an astronomical observatory. And there was a special building for the Academy Hospital, for example. But apart from that, there were no department offices or buildings. So anything that we sort of imagine today takes place at a university department, that would take place where the professors lived. So these houses that the Linnaeus household used and lived in, that is where the scientific work happened. That is where Linnaeus did his research. That is where he had his correspondence. They also had lectures here because they had private lectures, and people could pay to come to the lectures in the professors' homes. Not only Linnaeus did this, but other professors did this as well. So they had this series of private lectures that took place in their home. So these houses, they were like a semi-public space. It was not only the private home of this family and the household, it was also a rather public space where, for example, lectures happened and where they kept collections. I studied something I called performative practices. And a performative practice, that would be any kind of action or practice that manifests and forms role or persona and thus identity. And examples of performative practices would be different ways of using the rooms and the houses, for example, for lectures or formal dinners, because sometimes they were appointed to be hosts on behalf of the university. Self-presentation in different contexts, such as texts, portraits, or clothes is another example of performative practice. And also the use of examples in lectures is a performative practice. And through these performative practices, they formulate social identity and status. Sometimes this is very conscious. If you, for example, write text describing yourself or have a portrait painted, it is, of course, a very conscious practice. Sometimes it is maybe less conscious, like which kind of examples you use in lectures. There are kind of trends, and Linnaeus is doing similar things compared to other professors, for example. So some things are very typical for this time, for example. So I thought I would now give you a couple of examples of these performative practices that I have studied. One example is tea and coffee, and the serving of tea and coffee, because it was a popular, a bit of a trend, you could say, to have receptions where you served tea and coffee. They were kind of new beverages in Europe at this time. We know that in the Linnaeus household, they had everything they needed to have a rather fancy or modern or fashionable serving of tea and coffee, and probably also chocolate. We have this example with the Chinaware for tea and coffee that was ordered from China through Per Osbeck, one of Linnaeus' students that traveled to China, and the Swedish East India Company. And the case is that actually this was delivered twice to Linnaeus. It was a fashion among the nobility to have Chinaware bought or ordered from China, and they normally would pick the family's coat of arms as the decoration or the design for this Chinaware. Linnaeus, however, he picked this flower, the twin flower or the Linnea borealis. The Linnea borealis is named after Linnaeus. He did not name this species himself, but he asked Gronovius in Holland to name this after him. And if you see the two lower pictures here, the designs differ slightly if you compare these two items, both the plate to the right and the jug on the left. The pieces on the left in the picture have flowers that are a bit darker, and the shapes of the leaves differ a bit from the items to the right. The items to the right have a lighter color and slightly different shape of the flower and also of the leaves. The pot on top has got the lighter color and the slightly more oblong shape of the flower. The thing is that the pieces with the darker color and the shorter flower, so to say, they arrived first, and Linnaeus was not happy with this design. And there is a letter from Osbeck where he makes excuses and says he's very sorry that Linnaeus did not like this and that it wasn't good enough, because Linnaeus wanted a better picture of the flower on this Chinaware, a better depiction of it. So he actually ordered it a second time. So a second set was sent to Linnaeus, and the second time he got the ones to the right, the ones that have got a lighter color and sort of a bit longer flower and better shaped leaves. And why was this so important for Linnaeus? Well, this flower was like an emblem of both him and the family and the whole household. And on all portraits of Linnaeus, he includes this flower because it is a symbol for him. It's a symbol of the household and of who they are and aspire to be. So it was really important that this was depicted in a correct way. So they took the trouble to order this twice to get it as good as possible. And here you can see a close-up, where the one on the right is the correct one, and the one on the left is the first one that arrived. They also had everything they needed to serve tea and coffee. And here is an example of Sara Elisabeth, Mrs. Linnaeus' room at Hammarby with what we think is a coffee table. There is another type of table, which is a tea table that they also own, and they have every piece of equipment that they need to serve tea and coffee. And also, Linnaeus wrote 3 dissertations on coffee, tea, and chocolate also. And in these dissertations, he describes the correct, the proper way to serve these beverages. And he also lists everything that you need, cups and pots and tables. And it's particularly for tea, it's really a long list of things that you need to prepare the tea and serve it. And you can compare this to the Probert inventories and see that this whole list also exists in the Probert inventories. They had all these things. Yes, so the next example is, I'm going to say something about, is clothing. Because the way they would dress is also an important way to mark status and form identity. You want to have the right type of clothes for the right occasion. You should be able to vary your clothes so that you have the right attire depending on what you're going to do and what kind of occasion it is. That was very important. And also the clothes is the way you show who you are, and you can use this as also a sort of an extension of your identity in various ways. So both when it came to portraits and the way you actually dressed in real life occasions, that was really important. And there are some garments preserved in the collections in the Linnaeus Museum and at Hammarby today. There are also lists like the Probert inventories and some other sources where you can get an idea of what they actually dressed in. This here is a coat and waistcoat that is today preserved at Hammarby, and it's quite early. It's from the it actually has got a stamp from 1740. Now, it was for a long time believed that this stamp was a hallmark for Stockholm, but I've been able to show that this is probably a stamp for tax, because they introduced a new tax for silk in 1740. And the idea was that everything you had bought abroad should be taxed, and you got the stamp, and you could show that you had paid for your foreign silk. And then after 1740, they thought that we could produce all the silk we needed in Sweden. This didn't work, but they tried to move the production of luxury commodities to Sweden. This is also kind of an international trend at this time. Many countries try to do similar things. But had this been a hallmark, it would prove that this would have been made in Stockholm. But now it is actually the other way around, that since it is a tax stamp, it proves that this fabric is produced elsewhere. And the thing is that I actually found the lists of what all the Uppsala University households stamped for this tax in April 1740. It is a bit sad that Linnaeus had not moved to Uppsala yet in 1740. So I actually didn't really have the time to go to the Stockholm court archives to look through all these lists, because I think I would find Linnaeus's garments there. But here is an example of what one household at Uppsala University, one of the professors, Elias Frondin, his household owned these silk garments in April 1740. He took them to the university administration, they listed it, sent the list into a court, and then they also had this stamp to be able to prove that they had listed it and paid for it. And as you can see, they own a number of rather fine silk garments here, dresses, jackets, skirts. Also, they list jackets belonging to the maids in the end, for example. Usually made in a sort of more simple kind of silk, but still silk produced not in Sweden. This waistcoat and coat is an example of what Linnaeus would have been wearing in Stockholm, for example, when he visited the court in Stockholm, because he got some tasks at the court in the 1740s. Another example when it comes to clothing is the women's tight lacing. And here it is also quite interesting to compare practice and theory. This is a boned bodice, late 18th century, in the Linnaeus Museum, so it has belonged to one of the daughters. Linnaeus, both Linnaeus, Filius and Potter describe tight lacing in their lectures, and there is a critique against tight lacing and a defense. So, for example, the tight lacing was believed to hinder proper development of the body and growth of the body. They also thought that the lacing changed the structures within the body so that organs could change and move around in the body, and this could also change the effects and lead to unwanted behavior, such as indecent behavior, for example. And they also said that women that are laced from young age will have problems when giving birth, and they will also have fewer children than women who are not laced. In defense of tight lacing, they said that if you have this as a daily habit, you will develop a physical need. And there's a quotation here, the one that is not laced will collapse, they say. They also use an example in the lectures of a woman that goes to a party and she doesn't lace so tightly as she usually does because she is expecting to eat a lot of candy at this party. And then when she arrives at the party, she faints. And then when she wakes up again, she says that if you just lace me properly again and tight, really tight, I will feel well. And so she does. And the reason for this is that in all the medical theories, they believed that everything you get used to will become your second nature. So if you're accustomed to something and it's a daily habit, something you do every day, it might be something you eat every day or something you do every day, it will be a physical need. And if you try to change this, and particularly if you change this quickly, you will become ill or fall ill somehow. So this custom is a second nature was an important sort of principle in medicine. And because of that, you can talk about a kind of a physical need that has developed from a social practice, you could say, because all the women in the Linnaeus family, they were laced, they were expected to be tight-laced, particularly if it was a grand occasion or a festivity or so. This example is the wedding dress of the oldest daughter. Through this sort of medical arguments, you can argue that these women will physically be dependent on the tight lacing. Their bodies will be more healthy if they actually continue to be laced, since they had developed this as a habit from young age. These portraits of the daughters, they all show them in laced, tight-laced dresses. So I think this is really an interesting example of when you can compare objects in the collections, you can compare that with what they have in the property inventories, and you can compare it with the texts and what they actually say about this in lectures. And there is both this theoretical and practical aspect of this practice. It is very clear, I would say, that what they own, the commodities they have, the clothes they have, the furniture they have, glass, silverware, all that, that is connected to what kind of activities they have in the household. It is connected to these performative practices. So they have lectures, they have students accommodated in the house, they have colleagues visiting, and therefore they have dinners on behalf of the university. They have a need for things like very many chairs. They have flexible rooms where they can have lectures, or they can change and maybe show parts of the collections, for example. You can have a small number of guests for dinner or a big number of guests for dinner, for example. They have clothes for all occasions. And that also means they have a consumption on a suitable level. And that is part of forming the identity or the persona. You should do this on a suitable level. You should not aspire to be something you're not. And you shouldn't dress over or under your status. That was important, both. So in brief, the results I have found is that they do form a persona, an identity that is very characteristic for the academic context. This identity that they form, of course, has got similarities with other contemporary elites, primarily the nobility. And also, Linnaeus is raised to nobility, so he becomes also part of nobility. There is also a transition here to meritocracy, and this is particularly maybe obvious when you look at Linnaeus Filius and what happens also maybe after with the Linneans, the students of Linnaeus also. There is also development from an informal to a more formal style. So they become more, and they look more and more like the nobility, for example. But all the time, it's important to stress that temperance is guiding them. Temperance should be a guiding principle. So you shouldn't consume too much. You shouldn't be too luxurious, for example. You should stay on this proper social level. And I have labeled this persona that they form academic gentry. And it is a complicated term to use gentry in this respect, I know that, but it's also a translation of what I used in Swedish, which is, and I have used a term that is, it turned out to be somewhat difficult to translate to English. So academic gentry is the closest I could get, at least. And in Swedish, I call it akademisk ståndsperson. So I think that is what I'm going to say, and maybe there are some questions or so.
Thank you very much, Annika. That was fascinating. And there are a couple of questions, yes, which I'll get to in a minute. Before I forget, I thought it was very striking about the tight lacing, given that, and the whole kind of medical aspect to it, and the whole medical commentary made by both father and son, given that when Linnaeus comes to classifying humans, there's this whole class of variety of humans that he calls monstrorum, so monsters. Yes. And in there, he puts in there the kind of young women from Europe who are so tightly laced that they're almost deformed. Yeah. So interesting how what you say about these performative practices kind of almost are included also in his classification.
Yes, that's true. And I also find it interesting that when he classifies humans, he's using sort of outer features a lot. He's using like skin color and such. Yeah. I mean, not only he, but that's what they're doing at the time. But surface is kind of very important, and that applies also to clothes. because what you see is kind of what you should be able to trust the surface. You should be able to trust that if you look like nobility, you are nobility, so to say. So that's why it is so important to do this on an appropriate, level, and have the right type of outer surface.
Very interesting, thank you. So there are a few questions now. First one is, was Sara Elisabeth the beneficiary of works after Carl's death, like Athenaeus Michelet was of Jules Michelet? He's the author of History of France. Did Linnaeus know Michelet? I don't think he did, but
I don't know, actually. But if Sara Elisabeth continued his work, was that a question? Or
was the beneficiary of works?
I'm not sure. The thing, when he died in 1778, and what happened was that, and this happened to any widow of a person in state service, that they would keep the salary for at least 1 year, and usually 2. So she got his salary from the university for 2 years, and all the real estate that they owned, these farms outside Uppsala, she took over that. And then when she died, the children inherited that. Does that answer that question? Or
and I think also about his, I guess his collections went to her, and there was a bit of ambiguity and trouble with the son, wasn't there?
Oh yes, there was, because he got the privilege to appoint his own successor, and he appointed his son. And then he also decided that he was going to get some part of the collections, or the main part of the collection was going to go to him, so that he could use it as the next professor. And yes, the daughters and she had a conflict with the son on who was going to get what and what they were going to inherit, because all that, of course, had an economic value.
Thank you. Alexandra Cook asks, regarding the formation or presentation of the persona, does religion play any role?
It does, yes. I mean, the temperance is a classic religious virtue, of course, and they talk quite a lot about that or similar concepts, you could say. Yes, so that is, and I mean, they were all sort of believers, of course. I mean, they regularly went to church, and Linnaeus' father was belonged to the clergy. So yes, religion was an important part, because I would say religion and ethics were closely connected at this time.
This is a Catriona Cole actually makes an observation that I was going to ask you as well, because when you look at the list of employees, the footmen and the maids, they don't seem to stay very long. And in fact, some of the maids are employed 1 year and then they leave, and then they seem to come back 2 or 3 years later. So Catriona is asking, is this a standard practice or very hard work, given the numbers who were catered for, or is it, what's the reason for such a high turnover? And also the fact that some people seem to come back.
They probably don't come back. They have patronymicons, so they if the father is called Per, you're called Per's daughter, so it might not be the same person.
Okay.
Probably not, I would say.
Okay.
Yes, this is the common pattern. I mean, you can look at any household with servants, it will be like this at this time. And one reason is that the maids are usually rather young, and when they get married, they stop working.
Yes, okay.
That's one explanation. And the footmen are slightly older, and one of them stays for 5 years, and he has got a family of his own, for example. And it's only 2 times during this period where they had the same people 2 years consecutively in a row, so to say. So that happens only 2 times. So yes, it's a really big turnover, as you would say today.
Yeah. Thank you. And Griffith says, thank you for a fascinating lecture. When Linnaeus wrote his dissertations on tea and coffee, were these purely social customs, or did they relate to the botanical classification of the plants?
No, yes, they relate to the botanical aspect, and also a lot about the medical properties of these plants. So that's, I would say, is one of the key aspects in any dissertation would be the medical aspects, because he is professor of medicine, and botany is, they didn't really label it botany, maybe, or they probably would call it natural history or so instead. But the botanical aspect is, of course, there, and he discusses that also. But the medical properties, that's really important.
It's, I don't want to say a mistake, but it's in the title, isn't it? It's potus coffea or potus tea, which means like almost like the power, the kind of virtues, or whatever, however you want to translate that. But I hope I'm not getting my Latin all wrong.
No, and they are not, I mean, they are also short text. So it's not a lot in them, you could say. And there's a lot of references to other authors.
Yes, yeah. There are no more questions. I did, just to go back to Linnaeus's wife, Sara Elisabeth. I had heard that she was actually, so through the sources that are linked to Linnaeus, we don't get a hugely positive image of her. She's obsessed with card playing, for example. But I heard recently that actually she was a very astute businesswoman. She managed the estates. But you said that was after Linnaeus. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about her.
Yeah. She managed a lot of it while he was alive also, because she was, I mean, they would divide the responsibilities very sharply, I would say. So she's responsible for keeping the household and keeping accounts. Unfortunately, there is no account book, but there is a book where because on Hammarby and some other farms, they had tenants. So there is a book where they recorded what the tenants paid, and that is she writing it all the time. So all those descriptions of her, where she's described as this rather harsh and nagging woman, they are not by Carl Linnaeus, they are by other people.
Yeah.
So when he describes her in those CVs or autobiographical texts, he's appreciating her a lot, and he recognizes that she keeps household so I can work. And he appreciates that a lot. So I would say that most of that comes not from him, but from other people. And a lot of it has been reinforced by Blunt, for example, and by other biographers, like Fries also. So they are not contemporary sort of witnesses from within the household, but from other sources. But it is true that, I mean, these farms, it was quite a big enterprise to run and be responsible for all these farms that they had, and for the household with all the guests and the students staying there, and all this staff also, and the family, of course, with the children and so. So yes, she was. I think she was a skilled housekeeper.
Thank you. And thank you to Alan James, who has just corrected my Latin, because potus does mean drink. You're quite right.
Yeah, it does.
Drink, yes, yeah. Sorry for my over-interpretation of that word. There are no more questions, I think. So thank you so much, Annika, for a very fascinating lecture on Linnaeus on his birthday, which is very fitting. Yes, thank you so much. And everyone, as Padma indicated, we do have regular lunchtime and evening lectures. They're all listed on our website, so do have a look, and see you next time. Thank you, Annika. Bye.
Thank you.